Hello.
All right. Welcome, guys, and good evening. So today we are going to be briefly running through some brief diagrams here, right? Some brief diagrams which are already indicated, I believe, earlier in the group with regards to, with regards to our preparation. So just an explanation of these diagrams. I think there are about 3 or 4 more diagrams that we are going to do in the course of our revision, which is what's important, right? So with the aid of a diagram, illustrate and briefly explain the process of correcting a deficit in a nation's balance of payments by depreciating or a devaluation. So you realize that when we talk about a deficit here, when we talk about the deficit here, we really are talking about on the trade balance, right? We are just holding the other financial account constant, right? We are holding the financial account constant. So we are assuming that if you move towards a trade surplus, or if you make policies that take you towards a trade surplus, then in so doing, you are correcting the balance of payments deficit, right? You are correcting that deficit in the balance of payment. So we ignore the fact that sometimes policies that try and correct a deficit on the current account actually cause a surplus on, or actually cause a deficit on the financial account. So these ones always oppose each other. So we are going to be negating that fact. All right, so with the aid of a diagram, therefore, we need to make this illustration here. So when it comes to examinations, these diagrams need to be hand drawn. Right? These diagrams will have to be hand drawn. So what you basically do is you hand draw the diagram, and then you take a picture of the diagram, and then you can paste it on your Microsoft Word document. That is if you are going to be handwriting. Oh, sorry, that is if you're going to be typing. Then if you are handwriting, you can as well leave it there. So it's always good to handwrite, by the way. Then the one thing that we also need to be careful of, soon we are going to be having the solutions from the school of the second assignment. So there's going to be a very high risk of plagiarism when we make use of that second assignment. So they will actually repeat these questions on the exam. So we need to be thorough on these questions. So we are going to redo them again much later. All right, so what is a devaluation? So how I would prefer you to answer a question like this, right, is first of all to start off by a definition of a devaluation, what we are talking about when we talk about devaluing the currency, right? And because this was an assignment, we could have even mentioned countries that have devalued their currencies before. I believe it's countries like Japan and China. I think they have devalued their currencies, if I'm not mistaken. So we could have as well mentioned those facts there. Right? But basically, when we talk of a devaluation, it's a deliberate move by the authorities to reduce the value of, or to depreciate the foreign exchange rate. Right? So basically, it's a deliberate move for them to devalue or to reduce the value of their currency. So which is basically, in essence, depreciating the currency. But why do they do that again? They are normally doing that to try and correct a nation's balance of payments. So there are a lot of diagrams that we can use here specifically to give about that sort of illustration, because if a question is asking something like this, it's basically a vague question, because even the JCAV actually explains this. There are diagrams that we did at second level 2602 that do explain this again. So there are many diagrams that we can use, but I think our markers specifically prefer that we use this diagram, right? So what happens is when a currency is depreciated, let's say, let me make an illustration on this, right? Let me make an illustration on this in case, so that we don't ever miss this, right? Let's put this up there on a fresh page, right? Let's say we are dealing, what's the rate today? Anyone aware of the rate? I think maybe somewhere around 1815. let's just write the rate down. Let's say $1 is equal to, let's put it up at 1850. Right, let's put it up at 1850. So we have got two situations here, situation A and situation B. So under both situations, let's say you want to, all right, let's talk of exports. All right, let's talk of exports and then we put imports here. It's not so easy to come up with examples from your head, but let's just do that. Let's say under the first circumstance, we have a rate of 1815, right? And then let's say the rate depreciates to, let's say, let's not use the current rate. Let's say the first rate is 10 rand, right? Let's keep it simple. Then let's say this was in somewhere in 2010, the rate was 10 rand, right? And then today's rate is gone to 1850. Right, so we are still going to be analyzing exports and imports. So when we talk of a deficit here, we're basically talking about a situation where your imports exceed your exports. So when as a country you're importing a lot more than you're exporting, then you face a deficit. So in this instance, we are talking about a balance of payments deficit, which in effect occurs where, like we said, in the current account. So I think on the revision, we'll also look at the balance of payments statement in itself. We talk about that thing because that's also a favorite, right? That's also a favorite of our lecturers there. All right, so in a situation where the rate is 1:10, right? The rate is 1:10. So if we're exporting now, let's suppose there's a guy that's selling, or sorry, that's willing to buy at 1,000 rands, sorry, $1,000. A guy that's willing to blow $1,000. So situation A, let's deal with the exports here. So which means if this guy wants to blow $1,000, then it basically means how much is he gonna spend in the country. He's basically, if he's got $1,000, he's basically got how many rands? He's got 10 times 1,000. So which means basically our fellow here can buy stuff that is worth 10,000 rands, right? He can basically buy stuff that is worth 10,000 rands. So how do we go about that? We are simply multiplying 1,000 by 10 on the given rate, right? But if, let's say, you are importing here, right? Suppose you have 10,000 rands. Let's use similar amounts. Suppose you have 10,000 rands, right? How much can you buy in US dollars given that there? So let's just say this is, let's push this over there and say this is rands, right? I'm not sure how that's going to work. All right, then let's put this over here and say this is going to be dollars. All right, so with 10,000 rands at this rate, how much dollars do you have? So you can simply get that by dividing 10,000, the amount of rands that you have, by 10. So which means you basically can buy stuff that is worth 10,000, sorry, that is worth $1,000. Right? Stuff that is worth $1,000. So let's look at a situation now that the government decides to depreciate this currency. So this is the case here. Now, first of all, $1 was worth 10 rand. Now $1 is worth a lot more rands. So which means the rand has lost value against the dollar. It has depreciated against the dollar. So, and then obviously the dollar has appreciated against the rand. So remember, these events can't both occur at the same time, right? When one currency is appreciating, the other has to depreciate. All right, so with the same 1,000, after the so-called government policy, you are still dealing with the same people. How much can they buy now within the country? Which means that these guys can now buy 1,000 with the given rate times 18.5. Right. Sometimes you realize that when there is a currency devaluation, it does not mean that the prices are going to change, which is domestic prices. It's unlikely that domestic prices are going to change, right? They are virtually going to remain the same. Okay. They are most likely going to remain the same. So which means, for argument's sake, holding all other things constant, now the importer is buying. Our export industry now is gaining how much? 18,500 from 10,000 as a result of this change there. All right. But if you look at the import industry, with the given 10,000 rands, if you take this down here, with that same 10,000 rands, how much now are we able to buy? It's only 10,000 divided by 1850. So we are buying a lot less, close to half of the amount that we are doing. So 540.54. So a devaluation, you can see it causes our exports to go up while our imports are going down. So which is why some countries pursue this policy here, the policy of devaluation. So if it's an increase in the value of a currency, then it will obviously have the opposite effects then, right? So that's what's driving some of these countries to do what they do there. All right. That's what's driving them to do what they do. All right. Let's proceed. So what our diagram is explaining there is basically what we are talking about here. But let's look at it in terms of the diagram, right? Let's look at it in terms of the diagram here. So a situation where, right, if we analyze this here, under this situation here where we talk about where there is a deficit here, it's obviously a situation here you are looking at the demand and here you're looking at the supply. So this is the demand of foreign currency and the supply of foreign currency. So when the demand of foreign currency is high, a lot higher than the supply of foreign currency, what causes this demand to be high? So if you remember from second level, we were saying the demand of foreign currency is basically what we call derived demand or induced demand. Right? What induces that demand of foreign currency? It's your desire to import. So once you want to import, then you are going to demand the US dollars, right? So the US dollar is the reserve currency, right? The reserve currency of the world. We just don't know how long this is going to last. But currently it is the reserve currency. So meaning if you want to buy anything abroad, you are much safer now using the United States dollar. Say you want to trade with Japan, you first convert your currency, which is the South African rand, you convert it to the US dollar, and then from the US dollar to the Japanese yen or the Chinese yen. Okay. So the United States dollar is therefore that medium there. Okay, so whenever you see your demand high in this instance, it's because the main reason for that is because your imports are very high, right? Your imports are very high there. That is why you're demanding a lot of foreign currency. So the circumstances that cause your imports to be very high is when you have a very strong currency, right? Once you have a very strong currency, it means it's cheaper for you to buy abroad. So whenever the South African rand strengthens against the US dollar, then it means you can buy a lot more now from Shein, right? From that online store. From, I think, what's the other one? I forget the other online store that people buy from, right? So which means under these are circumstances when you have a strong currency. So because you have a strong currency, the effect of that is you want to import more, you are induced to import more, right? As a result of this strong currency. So at this point here, there is a deficit, right? At this point, there is a deficit, all right? At this point, sorry, I'm being interrupted here, and there's a phone call. Let me just pause this a little bit. Okay, so it stopped. Okay, let me just let's say I'm gonna call back shortly. Okay, gonna call back. Sorry about this, guys. I'm finishing class. All right, so once we have this here at this point, right? Once we are at this point here, which is right below there, where our currency is strong, we are importing a lot more. So you can see there that our demand for foreign currency is very high, right? Our supply is very low. So supply here comes from exports, right? So it means people are not buying from us. So how do we then induce these people to buy from us, right, and discourage us from importing? Then we devalue our currency, right? So it means as we devalue our currency, it's a movement along on that curve, right? It's a movement along. So remember, a movement along is obviously going to be a result of a change in the price of the currency. So here is the price of the currency. So it basically causes a movement along. So once we devalue the currency, then there is a movement along there on that curve. So as we move down, so this devaluation, these are going to be moving at the same time, right? There's a lot more involved, but for theory purposes, because sometimes you realize that the demand curve is not exactly the way it looks here, right? It may be shaped a lot more different than this in practice, and you wouldn't really know what the shapes are, you see. But in theory, we can as well conclude that whenever you devalue that currency, then you are moving away from this deficit. So right here is a surplus. Right here is a surplus. So you are basically moving away from that. So when we are correcting a deficit there through that devaluation, ideally we want to move from here to there, to the equilibrium point. That's where we want to get there. So generally speaking, we can't exactly say a deficit is better than a surplus or a surplus is better than a deficit. So in this question, why we prefer this question is because why we prefer this diagram is because the way the question is structured, we are simply correcting a deficit. So when you correct a deficit, you are not going for a surplus, right? You are simply going for an equilibrium there. So which is why point E is very important. So whereas when we start talking about stuff like the J curve, then you are moving towards a surplus there. So this is just about correcting a deficit. So we are moving from there right up until there. So this is what we are talking about there. So this is, of course, under the assumption that these are fixed as they are. So what does this one talk about? The other two lines here, or the other two graphs. So the main graph is the dark one here. The main graph is the dark one. So when we start talking about the other sorry about that huge top there. All right, let's just rush back to that diagram. I'm just gonna rush back to that diagram there. Right, so it's about, I was talking about the elasticities here, right, which is basically the gradient of this line. So here we are referring to a situation where we ask the question by how much must you depreciate your currency in order for you to correct this deficit. So you realize that if they are relatively elastic, like this one here, you only need to do that in this instance by from 1 to 120. So this is just about 20% thereabout. This is just about 20%. But once you consider a graph that looks like this, then you want to move from there to there. So you're looking at a point from 1 to 2 there. So which is about 100% depreciation of the currency, right? But the thing is now, we don't know the shapes of these graphs. Like this is just merely us mentioning this for theory purposes. We simply do not know the shapes of those graphs. So that's what that one was about there, right? And then this here now, where we talk about the J curve, right? This again, it's better to hand write, it's better to hand draw, right? It's always better, especially when you consider that here we work as a group. But again, our numbers are not so much. Our numbers are not so much. But again, it's a lot better if you can handwrite. You hardly get flagged for anything. And just be careful again with the invigilator app to follow all the promptings there. Right, so with the J-curve, we are pretty much explaining a similar thing, but now we are talking about the tendency of a nation's trade balance to first deteriorate before improving. Right, to first deteriorate before improving. So it's the same thing that happens here, but it's not really explaining that over there, right? It's not really explaining that. So whenever you devalue that currency, there is gonna be, it's gonna first start off by getting worse, right? By declining, by worsening, by deteriorating before it improves. So this is shown here by this J curve here. So why is that the case? So when you devalue the currency, I'm just going to explain this without reading this here. When you devalue the currency, people are used to buying things, say, from Shine. Right? People are used to buying things from Shine. So the fact that you devalue the currency now doesn't mean that people are going to start shopping now, or people are going to stop importing now. Right? That's not the case. There's that time lag there. So which means once you first do that devaluation, exports are going to be cheaper, but it doesn't mean that the market is going to respond quickly, right? Again, so in terms of preferences, for instance, if you are buying 5 bags of rice from South Africa, if you are the United States and you are buying 5 bags of rice, the fact that the currency has depreciated doesn't mean that you will immediately double your demand, right? It's not the case. You see, for the first time leg or for the first time period, we are basically going to be exporting the same quantities and importing the same quantities, right? But in that case now, your imports have become expensive, so which is why your trade balance is going to deteriorate a little bit. So the same amount of exports plus the same compared with the same amount of imports, the exports being cheaper and the imports being more expensive is going to result in this slight deterioration here before the market can adjust. So once the markets adjust, then it starts to improve there, and then it gets to a point where now it's in equilibrium there, right? And then should it persist over time as the markets adjust, then this is going to be an improvement there, right? So it's not, you realize that it's not going up forever. Like this is not going up forever. It's going this way, right? Obviously, because sometimes it gets to a point, even if rice is cheap, for instance, it doesn't mean that you are going to buy 100 bags of rice. You can only buy as much. So you can only improve your trade balance to a trade surplus only to a given limit. Right? You can't keep increasing that forever. So that's what's being explained there. Right, and then over on this diagram here, we're looking at the difference between a stable and an unstable foreign exchange rate, right? So both of these are stable, though you realize now that there's a difference there, right? There's a difference, particularly in the supply curve, right? But it still remains okay. Sorry, guys, I was muted. It's not your side. Sorry, it's not your side. It's not your side. Sorry, I was muted. After talking so much, this is so bad. All right, so I was saying, let's start off at this point here. If you are here, all right, let's start off with the deficit because that's what we spoke about on question 1. So if you want to correct the deficit here, what did we say you do? You basically depreciate your currency. So by depreciating your currency, you are reducing your demand. Like you are basically discouraging demand, which is imports. You are discouraging imports and encouraging exports. Then you move down right up until you get there. If you're at this point, you are at a surplus, you want to do the opposite of what you did there, right? You want to encourage imports. So you strengthen your currency, right? And then it moves along there from N right up until E. Here it's representative, your supply always represents your export. So if you strengthen your currency, your exports are going to get fewer. So this is going to move down that way. So the same applies there. The same applies there. But if you're dealing with an unstable currency now, you can't do the same policies, right? You can't do the same policies. If you look at this example here, so this is your supply and then this is your demand here. So let's say you depreciate your currency here, right? And then this is what your supply curve looks like. This is what your supply curve looks like. So basically what's happening here is you are going to worsen the situation because say your currency has been, as it were, your currency has been depreciated. So what we expect to happen here when your currency has been depreciated, then we are basically expecting a movement still going down there, right? Because this is an unstable currency. You can see the way this is shaped here. It basically responds different, right? Basically responds different to these changes there. So you will instead be moving from further away from E. Right. And then, like I'm saying, on our next session now, we are gonna try and look at situations where, all right, just give me a second. I just wanna open the door there for someone. I'm just a couple of meters away from the door. All right, so like I said, on our next session, we are gonna be up on this one, looking at practical examples. And maybe out of interest sake, like I said, what are the circumstances that can cause an unstable exchange market? And then come up with real examples of that. And then on our question 4, we had dollarization, right? We had dollarization. Last year, we had an interesting class on dollarization. Zambia dollarized some years back. Zimbabwe also dollarized a couple of years back as well. So what are the advantages of dollarization and what are the costs of dollarization there? So dollarization refers, obviously, we want to start off with the definition when we answer these questions. What is dollarization? Just to show the marker that you understand what we are talking about, that you are on the same page with the question, right? And with the person who's asking you the question, right? So it refers to a nation adopting a currency of another country, most often the dollar, as a legal tender. So that is what we refer to as dollarization. So what are the benefits of those? Avoiding the cost of exchanging the domestic currency for dollars and the need to hedge foreign currency exchange risk. So we'll talk about these again, some of the ways in which you can hedge against foreign currency risk, right? We're going to talk about those in the next session. I think we have questions here. They normally ask you definitions of currency options, maybe what hedging is, futures, and the likes. They are basically asking you those, a forward exchange contract, you see. And then facing a rate of inflation that is similar to the United States, so which was up until late very stable. I believe it is still stable. I haven't been following of late, but I believe it's still stable. So once you have adopted the dollar as your currency, then you can't expect your prices to keep increasing at a similar rate, right? And then, of course, you are avoiding a foreign exchange crisis when you are doing that, right? And then encouraging more rapid and full international financial integration. So remember, the dollar is the reserve currency anyway, so it's a way of international inclusion there. But what are the disadvantages of those? The cost of replacing the domestic currency with the dollar. So this is the real cost there, the real cost of doing that. This is when you are actually doing that format. It's very costly. The loss of independence, of course, you can still have your South African Reserve Exchange. So your South African Reserve Bank, right, in control, right? Remember, part of their job is to print money, to issue currency. So what currency are they issuing now? Because they don't have a currency. So, and then the loss of the central bank as the lender of last resort. To bail out domestic banks, we can't do that anymore. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's after 8. All right, it's after 8.